In this video, I'm going to show you how to create clean looking graphs as they make on the BBC News website just by using Microsoft Excel. I actually read an article online that the BBC actually use R to create their graphs, and they've created a set of instructions that are publicly available that you can freely access where you can actually replicate their style of graphs. So I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check that out. Now, if you don't know how to use R, don't worry, because there is actually ways you can mimic these styles of graphs in Excel, and I'm going to show you 3 examples in this video. So let's jump in straight into example 1, and let's dive into Excel. So I'm within Excel, and this is the first example data set that we're going to use. This is on the right hand side, this is the example graph that we're trying to recreate here. And it's titled Halting the Decline. And it essentially just shows the number of pubs or public houses in the UK and bars by size, hence the different colours. They represent the different sizes. And over time, it's just showing you how these are declining, especially those pubs or clubs that contain fewer than 10 employees in red. They are drastically reducing over time. So I'm going to recreate this graph, and the way I do that is I'm going to select all of my data here, and I'm going to go to Insert. I'm going to insert a column/bar chart, and it's going to be specifically a 2D column chart, and instead of being a clustered column, it's going to be a stacked column chart. And this is my example graph here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to overlay it on the example and just make it the same size, just so it's easier for me as a reference, and then I'll move it so it's at the side of the example. So the first thing that I notice when I look at my example is that my data series, so the 3 sizes of employees in the 3 different colors here, obviously they're different colors in my example, but they're actually the wrong way around, because the fewer than 10 employee group are actually presented at the top, whereas in the example, they're at the bottom, indicating in red here. So let's address that. And the way you do that is I'm going to right click on the bars, and I'm going to go on to select data. And in the Legend Aries box here, you can actually see the series of data that you have, and you can reorder them by using these arrows here. So what I need to do is move this value of 25 or more employees down to the bottom, and I need to move the fewer than 10 employees values to the top, and click OK. So now you will see that the pattern is the same as the example. So as I mentioned, the other main difference that you'll notice is the colors. And if I wanted to replicate the colors that are exact to the example, there are a few ways you can do this. You can upload the picture online and use a picker tool. But a cheat kind of way I like to do that's quite a quick way to do it is by actually using PowerPoint, because it has an eyedropper tool, whereas Excel doesn't actually have an eyedropper tool in it where you can pick out individual colors from a picture, for example. So I'll show you quickly how to do that. You simply copy the image. You then open up PowerPoint. So I'll paste my image in, and then I'm going to insert a random shape. It doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to change the shape fill. Now, what I want to use is the eyedropper tool here. And when you do that, you can then move your cursor over the picture itself and pick a specific color on that picture to actually copy that color. So I'll do the red color here for the fewer than 10 employees group, and you'll see it's recolored my square. For me to understand what that color is, I'll go back to shape fill and then more fill colors. And then I can then see the hex number for that specific color of red. And I just simply need to copy that value and go back to Excel. And then click on my bottom set of values, which is the fewer than 10 employees group again. And then what I want to do is go to Format, Shape Fill, More Fill Colors, and then you want to use a custom value, because then we can use the hex numbers. And they paste in my value and click OK. So that matches the example exactly in terms of the color. So I'll repeat the same process for my 2 other groups that I have on my graph, and I'll be back shortly. Okay, so now I've recolored all 3 groups to match the example. So now the colors are exactly the same. The next thing I noticed that's quite different from the example in the BBC News one is that their bars are quite thick and quite close together. So I'm going to replicate that. And the way you do that in Excel is you right click on a bar and click on Format Data Series. And that will open up the Format Data Series sidebar. And the specific value I want to change is the gap width number. And I'll want to reduce this quite a lot. And as I do, you'll see the bars are getting thicker. And an appropriate value here would be somewhere around, say, 12%, which mimics the example quite well. The next thing I want to address is the y-axes, because there's a slight difference when you look at the example. They have comma values to separate the 1,000 numbers. So the way you do that in Excel is I'll click on the y-axis itself, and then in the Format Axes sidebar to the right, I'll go to the Axes option on the far right. Under the number section, I want to expand that, and I want to change the category from general to be a number. And you'll see now commas are added. But Excel has also added something I don't need, which is decimal places. Now you can adjust that by using this decimal places option here. I'm going to change that from 2 to be 0, and then I'll click enter. So that looks great. And a few styling things I'm going to do before I wrap up the y-axis is increase the font size by using the options in the Home tab, and also change the font color to be a black. Moving on, let me now look at the x-axis. So you'll see that in the graph that I'm creating, the year numbers go up in every year, whereas in the BBC News example, it's actually every other year. So the way we address that is if you select the x-axis, and again refer to the Format Axes sidebar on the right, and this time I want to expand the labels drop down. And instead of being automatic, I'm going to specify an interval unit. And instead of being 1, which represents every year, I want this to be 2, which is every other year. So now that matches exactly. And again, another minor styling thing I'm going to do is increase the font size again, change this to black. And I've noticed that on the BBC News example, they actually have a black thick line to represent their x-axis. And the way you do that with the x-axis selected is you actually go to Format and it's Shape Outline. And I'm going to add a black line, but you'll notice it's quite thin. So what I might do is increase the weight of this line to be 1.5 points. So you see it's a bit thicker now. So that looks great. Now, moving on, I think another obvious difference here is the location of the figure legend. So this is the figure legend here. So it's the boxes with the text to represent what the categories are in the graph. Obviously, in the one I'm working on at the minute, it's at the bottom. And to move that, I can select it. And then on the right-hand side, I can change the position from bottom to top. You can also click on the graph and drag the legend around and resize it as you want. I think it's displayed something like that, isn't it really? So I shall move it there. And again, I'll change the font color to black and increase that ever so slightly, which is great. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So I think we're getting there, and I think the only other major differences is obviously in the BBC News example, they always have a bold title on their graphs, and also most of the time they also have a subtitle as well. Now what I'm going to do is just use the default chart title option here, and I'm going to copy the title they have. I'm going to use the font settings up here to make this black. I'm going to make it bold, and I'll increase the font ever so slightly, and then I can click and drag to move this around on my graph. So obviously it appears on the left-hand side. And for the subtitle, I'm actually just going to do a return under the main title itself and type this in. And then what I'm going to do is change it so it's left aligned. Now, obviously the subtitle I'm going to highlight because I want to reduce the size of that font ever so slightly. And obviously that one's not in bold. So let me move my legend down so it doesn't overlap. And then the last thing we want to do before I finish this first example is add the source text at the bottom and the BBC logo. Now, what I need to do firstly is actually make some room for this on my graph. And the way I'm going to do that is if I select the graph itself, so you can see that the white circles appear in each corner of the graph. This means I can adjust the size of the graph itself. So I'm going to move it there. And then to add the line that separates the footer, I will go to Format, and then here where it says Insert Shapes, I'm going to insert a straight line. And then I'm going to click on my graph, and whilst I'm doing this, I'm going to hold down the Shift key because that will keep it a nice horizontal straight line. And then let go, and then I can obviously reorientate the position. It looks a bit thick at the minute, and it's obviously in blue. So I'm going to change this to black and reduce the weight of it ever so slightly to be 3/4 of a point. Now we've got that footer separator in there, that line, we can now add that source text. And to do it, I'm going to select the graph, go to Format at the top, and under the Insert Shapes, I'm going to insert a text box. And then I'll click and drag on my graph, and then just copy the text that we're using here. And then it's just a case of moving it to wherever you want that to appear. I'll reduce that font size slightly. So that looks a lot better. And then the very last thing we want to do before we wrap up this one is add the BBC logo in the bottom right as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to Insert, Pictures, I'm going to place over cells, and it's going to be from this device because I've already saved the logo in a PNG format to my device. I'll then select the picture, click Insert. Obviously this is way too big at the minute, so I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to go to Size and Properties. And then on the right hand side, I can adjust the size here by using these values, or as it's being resized, so it's easier for me to actually control, I can resize the shape within the graph itself. So it's just a case of shrinking it down and then moving it to where I want it to be. So it's something like that. So there we go. I think that looks quite good. That's our first example. Let's now move on to the second example, which is a line graph. Now, this is the example we're working with here. It is a record fall in household income. That is the title. And essentially, it's obviously showing a change over time with a bit of a forecast in real household disposable income per person in the UK. Now, what's slightly different about this and what's quite interesting, and I'll show you how to replicate this, is there's a forecast box here, and also part of the line graph itself is solid, but inside the forecast area, it's actually a dashed line. So I'll show you how you can replicate this exactly by using Excel. Now, again, what I'm going to do is highlight the data, go to Insert, and this time it's going to be a line graph, and it's going to be a 2D line graph. So I'll select this option here. I'm going to, again, just overlay this with the BBC example and resize this so I can gauge where I'm working. And we'll move it to the side. Now, the first thing I want to do is actually remove the figure legend because that's not actually used in the BBC website's version. They actually have this bit of text here, which we'll recreate. So we can click on our figure legend at the bottom and delete this. And another thing that I'm noticing when I'm comparing these two graphs is that the y-axis values are slightly different to those on the BBC News website's version. Now, to adjust these, I will select this, and then in the right-hand side, I'm going to go to the axes option. And again, I'm going to expand the axes options, and I'm going to change the bounds. So the minimum, and these, bear in mind, it's percentage values, hence why it's being presented like this in the side. Negative 0.14 is actually negative 14%. That's what that is indicating. So the minimum value here, I need to change because on the graph we're recreating, it's actually 15. So we need to change that to a 5. And then as I've done that, Excel's actually adjusted it. So the top one is 5%, which is great. That's exactly what we want. Now, when I look at the graph that we're recreating, the major values are actually every 5%. So to replicate that, I'm going to change under the units section, the major part, I'm going to change this from 2% to be 5%. Now again, some minor styling things. I'll increase this font size slightly, which I think looks a lot better as 12. And now another obvious thing when you look at this example is by default, the x-axis here is crossing 0, whereas on the BBC News website's version, it's actually right at the very bottom. So how do we move this? And to do it, you actually have to select the y-axis here. And we'll go to the axes option and axes option again. Now, under the bottom here, you'll see an option that says horizontal axis crosses, and it's currently set to automatic. Now, what we can do is actually set a value where this is going to cross. And specifically, we want this to be crossing minus 15%. So I need to change this value to be negative 0.15 and click enter. And now you will see the x-axis has been shifted right to the bottom to cross that negative 15% mark, which is great. Similar to the previous example, here my values are going up every year, whereas here it was actually every 3 years. And to adjust that, I'm going to select the x-axis, go to the x-axis options, and then under labels, I'm going to change this from automatic to be a specific interval unit, and this I want to be every 3 years. So again, we're starting 2012, and then we're going up every 3 years, just like the example. In the example we're recreating, they have the tick marks that actually come off this. So if we go in the options on the right, under tick marks, we want to change the interval between the tick marks. And instead of this being every 1, we want to change this to be, again, every 3. Now, I can't see anything at the minute, and this is because I haven't set to show any tick marks on my graph. So under the major type, I'm going to change none to be outside. And they now appear, but they appear very faint. If I zoom in, you can actually see them appearing there, and there. And you'll also notice that they're not actually lining up with the values of my years on my graph. Now to address this, what I have to do is go back to the axis options. And then under the axis options drop down, I need to change the axis position. And I want this to be on the tick marks and not between them. So I'll click on the tick marks, and now they appear directly under each major tick, which is exactly what we wanted. And again, minor styling things, we'll just probably increase that font size ever so slightly. And we want to make the bottom x-axis stand out a bit more. So I'll go to Format, go to Shape Outline, and I'm going to make this black again and increase the weight of that mark to be 1 point. So another thing that when I'm comparing these graphs is I'll see that at 0%, they actually have a horizontal line that's quite thick there. In Excel, you can't actually individually change these lines in the back. You can only change how they all appear. Now, the cheat way of doing that to replicate that same effect is to go to Format and actually insert another line. Again, I'm shift clicking as I'm creating this line, and then you just overlay it onto that 0%. So you then have a similar effect. What I'll do quickly is just change that to be black, and I will reduce the weight a little bit. And another thing, obviously, I need to do is actually change the color of the lines. So I'll be back in a second by using that same technique by copying the image to PowerPoint and using the picker tool to pick out the same colors for the lines. So there we go. I have repeated the color process. Obviously, because these are lines, I've gone to Format and I've changed the shape outline fill this time to the colors that match the colors from the graph. Now, another thing, obviously, that's strikingly different is how in the forecast section that they have dashed lines instead of solid lines. Now, obviously, I haven't created that forecast zone just yet, and I'll show you how to do that very shortly. But I'll show you quickly how to do these dashed lines in specific areas. Now, what we want to do is to select the points that are after the area that we want to create the dashed lines. So instead of being this one where the dashed effect seems to appear at the year 2021, I'll click on this point here. And then what I'm going to do is go to Format, Shape Outline, and at the bottom it says dashes. And instead of being a solid line, you can actually change it to be anything you want really in terms of dashes. But the way they have it set out in the example is more like this second option here, which is the square dot. Now then what we want to then do is then repeat that process for all of the points that are thereafter. So I'll be back in a second once I've repeated that. And there we go, I've repeated that process for both of the lines in the graph. Now let's move on to how to create this forecast area here in grey. And quite simply, you can just insert a square shape and have that overlaid. So you'd go to Format at the top, and under Insert Shapes, I'm going to select a rectangle, and it goes from 2021 to 2027, and right at the top of the graph. So it's something like that. I'll remove the shape outline, and for the fill, it's going to be a grey colour, but I'm also going to go to more fill colours because I want to adjust the transparency a little bit to say 60% because I still need to be able to see those dotted lines on the graph itself. And when I click OK, you have that effect that now appears where you have a grey zone, but you can still see obviously the dotted area, those dotted lines behind it. So it's something like that. And the next thing, obviously, because there isn't a figure legend on here, the BBC News example have just inputted text values to represent the data series on their graph. You can simply click your graph, go to Format, and then insert that text box again. And it's just a case of adding text onto your graph in the appropriate areas and styling it to match whatever you want. So obviously this is like a bold text, slightly bigger, something like that. And then I'll do the same for March and the November points that are on the graph, and I'll be back in a second. So there we go, I've added my text, and I've also recolored it by going to Shape Format, Text Fill, and I've colored it the same shade of the blue and the red that I color picked from the original graph itself. And then all that's left is essentially to repeat the process of adding the title, the subtitle, and that bottom part of the footer and the logo. So I won't show you that again because I did that in example 1, but here is an image of the finished product. So let's move on to the third and final example I'm going to show you, and that is how to create a clustered bar chart. And this is the graph that we're going to recreate here. And specifically, it's just presenting from different countries how people avoid the news. And it shows you a breakdown of each country at 3 different timescales. So it's 2017, 2019, 2022. That's what the colors of each bar represent. Now, this is the data that I have, and I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to start by going to Insert, go to a column or bar chart, and it's going to be this 2D clustered bar option here. And I'll move this over the graph that I'm recreating just to copy the size for reference. Now, the first thing that I noticed straight away is that on my graph, Japan is at the top and Brazil is at the bottom, whereas actually it's the opposite way round on the BBC News website's version that we're trying to create. Now, to flip this data, I can right click on it and go to Format Axis. And then the option that I'm looking for is this one here, which is Categories in Reverse Order. And when I tick this, you'll then see that everything is flipped over to match the order that I'm after, but it's actually done something else, and that's by changing the position of this x-axis. So it's appearing at the top on the graph that I'm working on, but actually on the one I'm trying to recreate, it's at the bottom still. Now, to move the position of this x-axis, you actually have to select the y-axis, and then where it says horizontal axis crosses, instead of this being automatic, I want to set it to be the maximum category. Now, when I do this, it means it's going to be pushed right at the bottom to be the very end where that last category appears, which is obviously what the example is showing. Another styling thing that I'm seeing here is that in this y-axis, there is a thickening of this line. So if I select my y-axis and go to Format, I'll go to Shape Outline and I'll click the black line option. Another minor thing is that on my graph, the values range from 0 to 60%, whereas on the graph that I'm trying to recreate, it actually goes up to 50%. Now, to change this, it's quite easy. You click the x-axis, and on the right-hand side, I'll go to the axis options, and again, axis options, and I'm going to change the maximum value. Again, this is in percentages, so I need to change this to 0.5 to represent 50%, and click enter. But when I do so, I've actually just noticed that it's chopped off part of this data here, because this value is actually 54%. So the way around that is that I'm going to change the maximum bounds to 0.55, and then now obviously that messes up the actual numbering on my x-axis. So I'll then change the lower bound to be 0, so 0%. And now that has corrected, so it's going from 0 to 50, but it's also capturing that last part of the graph because it's actually going up to 55%, but the label is not appearing there. Another thing, again, we've covered that slightly in the first example, is the bars that are appearing on my graph are a lot thinner and the countries are more separated than that on the BBC News example. So obviously to change that, I can right click on these bars, go to Format Data Series, and I again want to change this gap width value quite considerably. So I'm going to reduce this down to be, let's see what a good value is. I don't know, 25%. I think that looks quite good. A lot more close together now, and we can see them a bit better. Another thing, obviously, I'm going to change where the figure legend appears because in the example, it's in the top left, which seems to be quite a consistent thing that the BBC News tend to do. So I'm going to go to the legend position, change this to top, and I'm going to move it slightly to the left. And then it's just a case of repeating the same kind of things that we've done to finish off that styling of the graphs to match that of what the BBC News prefer. And that's obviously to add in the title, the subtitle, and that footer with the logo. So I'll repeat that off camera because I've demonstrated how to do that on the first example, so I won't bore you again. But I'll show you now on screen. This is what we ended up with. And obviously another thing we did was to match the colors with that on the example that we were replicating, as we did in that first example by using the color picker tool in PowerPoint. So there we go. That's 3 examples of how you can replicate the BBC News graphs by simply just using Microsoft Excel. It's that easy. If you enjoyed this new style of video, please do let me know. And if there are any types of data presentation or graphs that you see online, maybe a news website or a marketing agency, if you like how they appear and you want to know how you could potentially replicate that in Excel, let me know in the comments below and I'll potentially do another video in this mini series, we could call it, on how we could replicate those graphs in Excel. So I'll see you in the next video.